Hey everyone, this is Jonas with AccuRC and welcome back to AccuRC Home Practice. This time around we're going to take a look at something that I really love about flying helicopters, which is autorotations, the unpowered art of flight. So what an autorotation really is that you are using the aerodynamic properties of your helicopter to fly it down to the ground without a motor. This can be used to perform a fancy autorotation landing after a flight, or you can save your helicopter in case your engine or tail rotor or something else fails. But I don't just want to show you how to autorotate, I also want to explain how autorotations work, why autorotations work, why the controls may not be as intuitive as you think, and how the energy management in the autorotation works. So I will be splitting this in two parts. The first part is the theory, the second part is the practice, and I will put timestamps down in the description so you can skip to either one if you are not interested in the other. Also, I am flying the Logo 700 in our Urcha center stage scenery, and the only things I did was to swap out the main blades for the Rotor Tech 710 because that's more representative of the blades most people fly. And I dropped my lowest RPM to 1100. You'll see why I did that later on. Okay, so let's first take a look at the concept of energies and energy conservation in helicopter flight. So you have three main modes of energy. That is potential energy, linear kinetic energy, and rotational kinetic energy. Jesus. Potential energy describes how much energy a helicopter has stored for the height it's at, or any object really. It's described as mass times gravity times height. So for example, if I'm hovering at 1 meter, I have half the potential energy as if I'm hovering at 2 meters. I can double my potential energy again if I hover at 4 meters, and so on. The higher I hover, the more potential energy I have. Well, now you may be asking, nothing is really changing about my helicopter if I go higher, but how we can visualize this energy is by converting it to, for example, I don't know, linear kinetic energy. Linear kinetic energy is described by a half times mass times velocity squared. So obviously I do not have any linear velocity in a hover, so my kinetic linear energy is essentially zero. But if I accelerate, I have a set amount of linear kinetic energy, which I can use to do other things. And since velocity is squared, to basically quadruple my energy, I have to go twice as fast. So a helicopter flying at 200 kilometers an hour has 4 times the kinetic linear energy than a helicopter flying at 100 kilometers an hour. But the interesting thing is that energies can be swapped. So for example, if I climb up and have a set amount of potential energy, for example, I'm hovering at, I don't know, 60, 70 meters. So now if I just dip down my nose, you will see that my helicopter will accelerate. And what I'm doing here is I'm swapping the potential energy to kinetic energy. So if we ignore air resistance and other losses, you could do a conversion between the energies and do an exact calculation. So I'm talking really exact as long as we know the gravity constant and the mass of the helicopter. No, wait, mass actually cancels out. Of how fast my helicopter will be going when it comes out at the bottom. So energy is mostly preserved in this case, just you're losing some to air resistance and the resulting drag. Another thing you can do with energy is convert it into rotational kinetic energy. So the main rotor also has an energy stored, which is, I think, a half moment of inertia times omega squared, where omega is the RPM of the rotor. So if I have 1000 or 1100 RPM, I have less kinetic rotational energy in the rotor than I have at 2050 or something. To be precise, the rotor has 4 times the energy at 2000 than it has on, for example, 1000, because RPM goes squared into the kinetic energy term. So the nice thing about this energy is it is also fully compatible with the others. So if I have a set amount of rotational energy and I switch it off and I fly up, I get exactly as much potential energy out of it as I had rotational energy if we ignore losses. What we also can do is we can swap kinetic energies between each other. So if I'm going fast, watch my RPM as I stop now. You could see that it went up to like 2600, 2700. Well, that's because I took the kinetic energy from my forward motion and swapped it into RPM by stopping the helicopter. So that energy was not lost. It went briefly into an increase in RPM, which then dissipated into heat, basically by drag, slowing the rotor blades down. And to make this complete, we can also, of course, trade kinetic energy into potential energy. So if we come in with a set speed, pull up, the helicopter will climb to a height that's equivalent to the energy that was in the system previously. And of course, we climb. Another thing we can do from potential energy is we can trade it for kinetic linear energy, so speed, and then trade that speed for RPM. So for example, if I fly up here, dip the nose, wait for it to build kinetic linear energy, and then put that into rotational energy, you will see that my rotor RPM climbed there. And that was a conversion through two energy forms where we went from height to energy to rotational energy, so RPM at the bottom. And once you understand this kind of play between the energies, you're basically good to go. You can understand autorotations. Because what we are doing is we're flying up. Oh, I can actually demo. Oh, wow, I'm done. I can demonstrate that. So we are essentially flying up in an autorotation, getting some kinetic linear energy, and then floating down while bleeding off the potential energy into RPM, which we then lose to drag. And the bit of linear energy we have, we flare off into RPM and then land. And that was not a good demonstration, but we made it. Okay, another thing about the theory I want to touch on is why we can actually auto-rotate. What drives the blades? Why does an auto-rotation work? And for that, we're gonna go to the workbench real quick, where I can demonstrate this to you by overlaying some fancy arrows in my video editing software. So if we take a look at the rotor blade here, you can see that it has an airfoil. So imagine the blade is turning. Obviously, the air will flow over the blade. So we will stop the blade right here and symbolize this with an arrow from the left. So imagine the helicopter is sitting on the ground, the rotor is spinning, and the air is flowing over the rotor blade. We're not getting any lift right now as the blade is at 0 degrees angle of incidence, so no angle of attack, really. All we're getting is drag from the blade, which will try to slow the rotor down, which we will need to overcome with engine power. So now what do we do if we want to fly? We increase our pitch, which increases our angle of incidence, which increases our angle of attack. The airfoil will then start doing airfoil things. I'm not going to go into Bernoulli and Coanda effects now, but just take it that the larger the angle of attack is between the rotor blade and the oncoming air, for example, the max pitch on this helicopter is plus minus 11 degrees angle of incidence. So in a static case where the rotor is just spinning while the helicopter is sitting in place, we can assume that the angle of attack is approximately angle of incidence if we ignore induced flow into the disk. So for simplicity's sake, let's say we're hovering at like 5 degrees. And let's take a look at what's happening. So obviously the air is coming on and it's creating a lift on the airfoil. The lift is perpendicular to the oncoming air, so it points straight up. We also have a drag component that tries to slow the blade down. So we have these two forces, lift and drag, and if we look at the resulting force, it is behind the vertical of the airfoil. What does that mean? That means that the total force is exerting a braking force on the rotor blade, trying to slow it down. How do we overcome this? By powering the blade with the motor of the helicopter. So the motor produces a torque which moves the blade through the air and offsets the drag force of the air trying to slow the blade down. Now, obviously, as you start to climb, the inflow into the disk will come from above and lower the angle of attack a bit, but we're not going to look at these effects right now, because all I want to do is explain how an autorotation works. So as you sign an autorotation, we are basically in a steady state of descent, at least in the stabilized autorotation. So the idea now is that in an autorotation we are sinking through the air, so the oncoming air onto the blade is now not straight on, but slightly from below. I'm going to do this a bit exaggerated so it's more visible. So what happens now is that the lift vector is still 90 degrees to the oncoming air. So the lift vector is actually pointing forward now. And the drag vector is also in a straight line with the oncoming air, so it's still pointing backwards. If we create the resulting force of this, we can see that it moved forward in relation to the axis of rotation of the main rotor. So what we can do now is, if we give it negative collective and pull down a bit, we can tweak the scale of the lift and drag vectors so that the resulting force lays in front of the vertical, and that is where autorotation happens. When the resulting force is either in the vertical or in front of the vertical, we either have no forces attacking the rotor and trying to slow it down, or we have a resulting force that is driving the rotor, gaining us RPM. So that is essentially the theory behind autorotation. The air comes in from below, and that shifts the lift and drag vectors forward enough so that the lift of the rotor blade actually drives the rotor and provides RPM for us to fly. Now, I'm going to show you that you can also autorotate at flat collective and at slightly positive even. So let's display our transmitter. So if we're at flat collective, what happens when the air comes in from the bottom initially is, let's say we're at 2000 RPM. The drag will be very high because the rotor is obviously spinning very quickly, and drag takes the velocity squared. So if you have twice the RPM, you have 4 times the drag on the rotor. So what we will initially have is little lift, a lot of drag, the rotor will slow down. But as the rotor slows down, the drag will get less. The lift will also get less, but the direction in which they face will stay roughly the same. Of course, the angle of attack will be a bit steeper because the rotor will be spinning slower, so the oncoming air will be seen slower, so the sink rate has a lot more influence, which will also bring the vectors a bit forward. But the decrease in drag is mainly what keeps the rotor spinning. So as the RPM decreases, the total force vector on the rotor blade will come forward until it hits the vertical, and then we have reached equilibrium again. No more braking force on the rotor, and at around 1000 RPM for this helicopter, it will stabilize. So you can auto-rotate at 0 collective. So what happens if we increase the collective? Of course, our drag will rise again because we're showing more blade area to the oncoming wind. But that will just slowly bleed off RPM until we reach the point again where the lift and drag vectors, so the resulting vector from these two vectors will be in the vertical again. This resulting vector, pretty much if it's forward of the vertical, it will drive the rotor, and if it's backward of the vertical, it will slow the rotor. So we're slightly positive, and we are auto-rotating along at 700 RPM or so. The drag will be low enough that the lift can still drive the rotor, but if you increase it further and further, at some point the drag will overcome the lift, it will completely overpower the lift, the blade will not be able to sustain the flow, so it will detach, the blade will stall, your heli will most likely blade stop, and you're gonna have a bad time. Okay, now let's continue in flight mode, because there is one more concept I want to demonstrate before we get into the practice of autorotations. So, when your helicopter is in an autorotation, you may think that collective will be your first instance to change your RPM, and that cyclic elevator will be your first instance to change your speed. That is not the case. So if we look at RPM and transmitter sticks again, you will see that if I just come in and I pull, my rotor speed will immediately climb. But if I drop my collective, it will take a good while for the rotor speed to come up at all. And that is because of the inflow into the disk being wildly different between these two control methods. If we have forward speed, right, and we're auto-rotating along, I will demonstrate this just at a low level, and I will fly directly at the camera so you can see what the oncoming air sees. So if we auto-rotate along, you can see that a portion of the rotor disc is visible, right? Like a small elliptical shape. Now what happens if we drop the collective? Not much. The oncoming air will slowly increase from the bottom. But what happens if we quickly jab the cyclic back in a flare is we will expose a lot more of the rotor disc to the oncoming air. So the lift vector will shift down, as we saw previously, and there will be a lot of lift driving the rotor suddenly. You can see that easily flaring in these attempts to 2100 or so RPM. So what you want to do if you need RPM is pull back on the cyclic. Don't be scared about that. It will give you RPM, and with that RPM you can do more stuff. Similarly, use the collective to control your sync rate. Your forward speed will be mostly consistent during the auto rotation, so don't worry about that. But your collective, if you need to sync steeper, drop it. It will fall faster and it will start building RPM slowly. That is not what you want if you need RPM desperately, so you pull back when you need RPM. You drop the collective or increase the collective when you need to extend or shorten your glide. Okay, so let's get to the practical part. We're gonna focus on a standard auto rotation first, which has 4 phases, which I will demonstrate very shortly in an auto-rotative descent. You can watch my RPM and my collective while I do this, and I will just comment on it while I'm doing it. So we're gonna climb and we're gonna get into position. If you look at my helicopter, it's hovering up there nose to me, for example. And what I want to do first is do the initiation of the auto rotation. So I want to gain some forward speed. I want to drop my collective and I want to switch it off. Now we are in steady state auto rotation. So the rotor is stabilized at like 1400 RPM and the helicopter is sinking. That phase can vary with your forward speed and your airspeed and your collective setting, but generally just dropping the collective a bit with some forward speed is enough. So let's do this again, because we're preparing for the flare. For the flare, we are pulling back the nose to brake the helicopter, and then we're gonna land it with the RPM we are building in the flare. So again, let's do a flare again. So I'll bring it into a short auto here. Auto rotate, flare, and land with the remaining energy. These are the last two phases, the flare and the landing. So let's break that down. And we're gonna go backwards actually with this, because I want you to be comfortable with landing first before we do anything else. So what you want to do is bring your helicopter into a hover at a medium RPM. I'm doing it at 1700. Switch it off and bring up the collective until it lands. Bring it into a hover, switch it off, bring up the collective until it lands. This way you're bleeding off the rotational energy into lift, pretty much. Lift and drag. And using that to stay airborne until it's not enough anymore to land the helicopter. So bring it into a hover, switch it off, hover it until you reach the upper stop of your collective and the helicopter forces. You're gonna do that a couple times. And once you've done that, you should be comfortable with landing your helicopter with the remaining energy in the rotor. Now the important bit is to not do this at a too low or too high RPM. For example, 1100 RPM, I will not have much energy, maybe hovering for 1 second. Didn't even get to 2. You also don't want to do this from your 3D RPM, because like that gets you 4 to 5 seconds of hover, and you really don't have that much time after a normal auto rotation. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4.5. Yeah. So do it from a medium RPM to get a good feel for what energy you may have left after a normal auto rotation. Next phase is the flare. I want you to be able to flare confidently and at one height. So what we're doing to achieve this is we just fly forward pretty quickly, and then stop. And you could watch my RPM there, it climbed. Do that again, fly forward, and stop. Reach 2000 there, not bad. And the idea is to be able to stop the helicopter while not climbing. So for example, if I did this wrong, intentionally doing this wrong, just pulling up makes my helicopter climb and I would crash in an auto rotation. So coordinate your collective to go down as you pull back to keep your altitude. And watch your RPM climb through the ceiling. The faster you go, the more RPM you'll build. The quicker you flare, the more RPM you'll build. So let's go full speed on this. 150, and I did not see my RPM there, but it went crazy high. But yeah, again, practice this at medium RPM, medium speed, and just pull back and see what collective inputs you need to keep the helicopter at one height when you flare. Do this a couple times, and also practice getting it into a hover afterwards. Okay, so now that we're comfortable with landing with the remaining energy and flaring, we can fly our first auto rotation, and that is why I set up a lower RPM earlier, because we're going to use that now to fly the auto rotation, and we're going to do this with the entry, because I'm going to actually show the entry a bit lower. because you cannot really see my helicopter up there. So let's imagine I'm 200 meters high and want to enter an auto rotation. What do I do? The most important thing is that while your motor is running, you can put all the energy into the system you want. So do not be scared to give it a bit of forward speed. Experiment some with what speed you need, where you need to put your collective before you switch it off. Because while your motor is running, nothing can happen. When it's off, you're managing your energy. There's no more motor to give you more energy than you have in your system. So we fly forward, we drop the collective, and now we could switch it off. So practice that transition a couple times. Fly forward, level the helicopter, drop the collective, and now we could switch it off. The idea is to not have the nose too low or too high, because that would break. Gain your speed, level the helicopter, drop the collective. Your helicopter will not change much in speed if your rotor disc is level. You can have it tilted forward slightly, but you don't really need to have it nose down. So I don't want to see anyone doing stuff like this. Drop the collective and then come in at this attitude, because you're gonna have a heck of a time catching that. Similarly, if you initiate the auto rotation and then pull back too much, it will stop, it will fly away from you. Good luck saving that if you're new to auto rotations. So, once again, for practice, gain some speed, level it off, drop the collective, and you're good. I'm gonna reset real quick because I was lazy again and did not set my battery emulation off. So, let's continue. You want to have a RPM set that is low enough for you to be able to overrun it in auto rotation, but high enough for you to hover. For example, I'm doing 1100 on this low to 700. It gives me some margin to climb, but not much. And I can easily auto rotate over that. So let's do our first auto rotation. What you want to do is fly up, get yourself into position, happily fly a bit further away. I will show you my orientation right now, I cannot zoom in further, but I'm flying with the nose to myself and in a hover right now. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna gain forward speed, enter the auto rotation as we practiced, lower my collective, and then switch down my RPM to 1100. Let's do this. Fly forward, level, drop collective, switch to 1100. You can see my RPM decays, but it stabilizes somewhere around 1600 currently. Okay, and then you can just fly out of that because you were a smart guy and or girl and still have some low RPM set, which enables you to not have to worry about landing at first. So let's go up and do that all again. We hover up here, gain some speed, level off, drop the collective, switch down to 1100, and watch what happens. The RPM stabilizes at like 1300-ish, and I do not have to do anything. I did not even touch my sticks in this descent. And that really demonstrates how easy an auto rotation is after you have reached steady state. I will zoom out a bit again so you can see that as well. So let's do it again. Gain speed, level, drop collective, and switch down. I'm a bit slow, so I'm gonna drop my nose a bit to gain a bit of speed. But you can see how it's stabilizing the RPM. And I'm doing minor corrections while the helicopter flies itself. That is something really beautiful because it allows you to get into an auto rotation without much hassle, and you can always fly out of it. So the next step is to practice your flare. Fly forward, level, drop collective, switch it off, and now we concentrate on the flaring. So once we come down here, we're gonna pull back on the cyclic as we practiced and stop the helicopter from flying forward. Then we level off as we lose our speed. If you watched my RPM there, it most certainly climbed. I did not watch it there because I was concentrated on flying, but I'm gonna do it again so you can watch. Let's do this again. Gain some speed, level off, drop the collective, switch down, coming in hot, pulling, and as my forward speed declines, we're swapping this linear kinetic energy into RPM. And you can see that my RPM climbs every time I do this. Okay, so now it's on you practicing this. Swapping energies from potential to continuous RPM, then kinetic linear to kinetic rotational, and then getting into a hover. So once you can get it into a hover safely, you can play with the RPM a bit more. So if you drop the collective a bit further, you will see that it stabilizes at a slightly higher RPM while it descends faster. Flaring will yield you an RPM increase, and then it will visibly drop after you start hovering. This is also something important. Once you bring it into a hover and the RPM is still dropping, you did everything right.
Don't worry, we did everything right. Something strange has happened. You taste metal.
Because then you effectively auto-rotated the helicopter without losing any RPM in the process. And don't be scared to kind of come in a bit faster. That will just yield you more energy to convert into RPM. So now obviously I've done this a billion times and I know exactly what to do for the helicopter to come out right in front of me. So what if you cannot do that? Okay, so let's take a look at how to shape our glide slope. So what if you're coming in, for example, from too far up and too far overhead? Let's do this again. Gain some speed, levels, lower collective, switch down. It seems as if I'm horribly overshooting, so why not drop the collective a bit more to gain some sync rate and to come out in front of me? Nothing wrong with that. Just do not floor the collective because that will start breaking your rotor again and yield you excessive sync rates. But manipulating the collective a bit is nothing to worry about. So also, for example, what if I'm just a bit slow and I may not make it? Nothing wrong with dropping the nose a bit, gaining some speed, leveling off again, and bringing it in. The key is to fly the helicopter as you would if it's powered, just without using the collective to accelerate it. So what you can also do, for example, what's another good use case? Oh yeah, you may start too low and too far away, but you may have good speed. Oh no, I'm not gonna make it. Why not increase your collective a bit to extend your glide? Easy, bringing it right back. You really don't need to be scared to manipulate your collective to adjust your glide angle. It really is not that critical. Also, what if you are kind of low on RPM? So let's just enter this at 1100. I'm gonna switch it off to demonstrate this. So, oh no, I am low on RPM. I'm at 700. Well, why not pull back and gain a bit of RPM? Level it again and continue the auto rotation. If you pull back, you will immediately gain RPM. So I'm at 600 right now. Oh, I crashed. Okay. That was not a good demonstration, but you get the idea. I actually ran into retreating blade stall there. But yeah, once you can shoot auto rotations and come out in front of you, you can switch it off if you like. So we once again go up and up and up and up, set up our approach, gain forward speed, level, drop collective, and this time we switch it off. So now we're flying unpowered. The only thing you need to mind is that once you flare and level it off, you're gonna do the whole thing with the collective increase to let it settle down again, which we did in the beginning to practice. After the flare, you will have like 1600-ish RPM if you did it right with a 700, and you can easily use that RPM to essentially land. Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. So let's do that again. Come in, level, drop, off. See, I'm modulating my collective down a bit to get the glide slope right. Come out in front of me, flare, brake, use energy, land. And the nice thing about AccuRC is it auto-rotates exactly like in real life. So if you can pull it off here, you can pull it off in real life. It's that easy. So now what else can we do with this newly gained knowledge? I mentioned earlier that we can auto-rotate at 0 collective and slightly positive, so why not try this? So the thing is that if we go higher on the collective, as mentioned in the theory section, that the helicopter will auto-rotate at a lower RPM. So I'm at 0 collective now and auto-rotating. See, the RPM is dropping, but no need to worry, it will stabilize shortly. Yeah, here at 930, and you can see the helicopter is floating. I'm not touching anything, right? I'm just gonna give it a tiny bit of forward cyclic so it does not lose all speed, and we are happily auto-rotating along. The helicopter is pretty much flying itself. Now, the only thing you should do when you do this kind of floater auto is to drop the collective to gain a bit of RPM way before you land. That was a bit late already. Kind of was lucky there. Probably would not have been that smooth if I did it outside on a harder surface. So imagine you're floating along, floating along, floating along, and you say get close to the ground and want to land. 900 RPM are not going to cut it for a flare, so drop the collective, drop the nose, gain a bit of speed, flare, CM at 1500 again, and can land. Super easy. Okay, so let's find the limit of auto rotation on this helicopter. So if you are in steady state auto rotation, you can go slightly positive, for example, like this, and it will stabilize at around 750. Can go a bit more positive with this helicopter. I know that was too much, but around 700 can be stabilized, and it will yield a low rate of descent. Of course, drop the collective and flare it before you land so you have enough energy in the rotor to actually make it. Once you can do this, you can also start goofing around with building turns into your auto rotation, because the nice thing about turns is you can steer your auto where you want to. So let's do a couple turns in an auto rotation. Gonna do the usual procedure: gain speed, level, drop the collective, and do a right turn, do a left turn, flare a bit, come in, and land. The thing with turns is that you should be wary not to do them too steeply, because you could very well lose some RPM that way. But gently turning is never an issue in an auto rotation. So, for example, you can also go ahead and, for example, just do a full circle while auto rotating. Just make sure you keep your sync rate and the flow through the rotor. Flare, and land. Of course, you're gonna want to auto-rotate inverted again at some point, because who doesn't want to auto-rotate inverted? But for this, we're gonna take a look at a different technique, which we're gonna first check out in normal flight mode, because for inverted autos, the procedure is generally a bit different. I mean, of course, the physics still applies. So I could come in, level, go positive collective because it's inverted, and auto down like this, but what are you gonna do with your energy? You're not really gonna have that much energy to flip around and land, because the flip will eat up most of your RPM. So we're gonna do it a bit differently. If you remember, I explained that in normal auto rotation you're trading potential energy for continuous rotational energy, which is bled off into the atmosphere, while you keep your linear kinetic energy in the descent. What we're now gonna do is we're gonna build a kinetic linear energy and trade that all at one point into rotational energy. So we're gonna come in, we're gonna do a steeper descent, build some speed, switch it off, and then flare it hard. You can see I just flared to 2800 by just doing that. So the idea is that we, for inverted autos, are instead going to build speed, build a lot of RPM, and use that RPM to do whatever we want to do. So I can do one more on that battery. So for example, you can come in, do this kind of thing, build speed, flare, and then happily flip it around and land it. You see how much time I had there, how much energy I had? That's completely different than if you float down normally and try to flip it afterwards, because a flare from a high speed is going to yield you a lot more rotational energy or RPM than, wow, that was spectacular, than a flare from low speed. That technique is pretty self-explanatory. You just go fast, you flare everything into RPM at once, and then you use it for 3D. The only thing you need to keep in mind is that when you flare, that you actually give collective in the right direction. Because I recently saw someone who claimed, oh no, AccuRC does not auto-rotate correctly. I asked them for a video, and what they did was they came in, they flared, but they did not trade their linear kinetic energy for RPM by actually flaring. They used the energy they had in the rotor to stop the helicopter. And that obviously is not what you want to do. A flare should not use RPM. So what they did is they came in and then they pretty much did what I just did. They gave negative collective instead of positive, using the energy stored in the rotor to slow the descent. But you do not want to use that energy. You want to use the energy from the descent to speed up your rotor. So the correct way is to come in, to give positive collective when you're inverted, and that will then yield you the conversion from linear kinetic energy from your helicopter speed to RPM, instead of working with the rotational energy stored in the rotor in form of RPM against the kinetic energy, and pretty much just losing all energy into some air movement and sound and whatnot. So yeah, I'm gonna show that upright again if it's hard to imagine and inverted. So what that person essentially did was this, and I do not have any energy left right now. But what you want to do is, instead of going positive, you want to go negative and see how much RPM I build. I can do happily a full roll here before I have to land. That is the only thing you need to keep in mind, to always flare with the correct collective direction. So if we come in here, we build speed, we go positive collective to let air flow through the rotor to slow the descent and to flare, and then we flip it over. And I'm gonna demonstrate a couple 3D autos you can do, but I'm also gonna send you over to my private channel where I have 5 videos of just auto rotations, where I do like 50 different 3D autos. The last video even has stick moves, so you can see exactly what I'm doing. And yeah, that is pretty much it's not complete. You can always do some other stuff, but for example, stuff like this, the double roll. I come in, I flare, and I just do 2 full rolls before landing. Something like that is in there, or a double auto rotation where I come in, use the energy I built to fly up again to just initiate another auto rotation. So I'm coming in fast, building a lot of RPM, using that to fly up again, level it out, and start another auto rotation, which allows me to land safely. That kind of stuff is in there. We also have stuff like the procrastinator, where you really hang onto your inverted attitude until the last second. So we come in, we fly, we fly, we fly, we fly, and then we flip. Gosh dang it, I crashed. Okay, yeah, that was maybe a bit too long of a hang. What else can we do? We can do I don't know. For example, half a pyroflip auto, or a half pyroflip auto. We can come in and just bring it around with a half pyroflip. We can also do this with a complete pyroflip. So fly up, auto rotate, break it down, pyroflip, bring it in, and land. You can even, if you manage to build enough RPM, can do a tick-tocking auto. For example, you come in, you always come in fast with these. Build RPM, do a bunch of tick-tocks, flare it again while braking, and land. And this stuff is really, there is no limit. You can also do stuff while descending. For example, extremely long floater autos where you flip inverted and normal numerous times. Let's do that. Let's really gain some height. I hope you can still see the helicopter. If YouTube compression makes it hard, I'm just going to announce what orientation I'm in. So I am upright and starting the floater auto. Then I'm flipping to inverted, floating on, flipping normal, floating on. I'm just rolling along right now. Then we can change directions. Keep floating, roll, turn it around, flip, oh crap. Do not lose too much RPM, flip, flip, roll, roll, flip, and land. This is kind of the stuff Nick Maxwell likes to do with his helicopters. And yeah, this sim also is Nick Maxwell approved, so what else do I have to say? What you can also do is a Bladestop, which I would not recommend. I did 10 Bladestops in my life, all with my 600s. It was hella scary and I'm not going to do it again, except for in the sim, because why not? You fly up, you switch it off while holding full positive. You have it tumble, you drop the collective, hope that it starts spinning again, regain auto rotation, flare, and land. As easy as that. And I guess to end the video I'm gonna do another auto rotation, but it's kind of pointless since we did like 100 of these in this video already. So what's also neat is the inverted loop auto. You come in, you go up, you come around in a loop, roll it. I was zoomed in too far. I'm gonna blame it on that. What I was gonna say is the inverted loop auto, where you come in hot, inverted, you flare it, you do an inverted loop, you roll it around, and then you land it. Hallelujah. Well, I hope you learned something. I hope you found this informative. I hope you also learned something about the theory of auto rotations. If you liked it, share it with your friends. See you next time.